Hi, everyone. I'm Sierra Schnitzer, Senior Director of Survivor Supports and Initiatives at Jewish Women International. I'm really excited for us all to be together today. I think today's topic is really important, especially when we're talking about the work that we do and really making sure that our messaging, the words we use, how we say things aligns with all of our work and making sure that everyone's in a safe space. So I just want to thank OVW again so much for being able for us to do this work. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Alana.
Thank you so much, Sierra. I'm Alana Bloom, the Senior Director of Community Response at Jewish Women International. And to start today's program, we're going to begin with an opening question. Drawing from the experiences of your organization, how can advocates develop culturally competent messaging to engage men and boys of faith in their programs? Let's start with Ujima, one of our consortium members.
I knew you were going to start with me, Alana. It must be because our names are kind of similar. Hi, everyone. My name is Ayana Wallace-View. I'm one of the Training and Technical Assistance Managers with Ujima. We're the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community. And so the first question, when I think about culturally relevant or culturally competent messaging, I always have to remember that the messaging needs to come from the community. And so it needs to be based on community needs, based on the language used in community. I think it's really important to actually use the language that's familiar with and used within a community. And so we want to be reflective of those we're serving, even if we're not directly from that community. Like, we still want to make sure that they're centered and that they're really leading the projects that we're developing out and in the messaging that we're developing out as well, because we can't speak for a community, but we can take what they say and transform it into something useful. And so I think about, in terms of messaging, being really intentional about the framing, making sure that we're unpacking different layers, making sure that we're carefully navigating conversations that are difficult within a community and acknowledging when they're difficult as well. And then just generally making sure that whatever messaging we are using isn't framed in a way where folks will feel that they're going to be, or folks will feel off-put, or folks will feel like they're going to be bashed. And so when I think about like men and boys work, especially, a lot of men and boys are maybe hesitant to engage in conversations about violence against women, for instance, because they might feel like they're going to be bashed. And so making sure to frame it in a way we're uplifting men and uplifting boys in the work that we're doing, but also unpacking those different layers is really important. So I'll just say that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayana. Next, why don't we go to Peaceful Families Project?
Do you want me to respond, or since
I wasn't sure if Denise was here.
Oh, okay. No, I don't think she's able to attend.
Okay. In that case, next, let's go to Korean American Family Services.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sunny Kim from KFAM, Korean American Family Services. To answer this question, first of all, I think it is really important for our advocates to really understand the culture of specific faith group, and to really understand that we may not be the expert. So also, what really worked for our organization when we try to reach out to our Christian faith community is that we had a group of faith leaders that helped us from the very beginning till the end. So they were called Korean Faith Advisory Council. So that we had a monthly meeting with them, and they really helped us with.
Did you see Marcus's text?
How we could draft a culturally.
You're on mute, Suni.
Oh, okay.
I think everyone was automatically muted.
Okay, I don't know where I was cut off, but I'll continue. So we had a monthly meeting with Korean Faith Advisory Council, and they really helped us from the outreaching and drafting the message and materials. So so it was really helpful because we had a group of people from that community, faith community, that really contributed, and I do agree with Ayana saying that it has to come from the community. And just because, I mean, just because we might not, we were not the expert of that community, we're not from that community, we are not the expert of that the specific big group, you know, it really worked out well because I mean, they were always with us whenever we were trying to reach out to our community and try to create the message. So that's how KFAM did it with our big community. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Suni. Is anyone here from Catholics for Family Peace? I don't see Sharon, but I just want to give her an opportunity to answer if she is here and I missed her.
Hello, I'm Lori from Catholics for Family Peace. I think Sharon may be coming later, but I would put in that I think visiting boys' schools, boys' high schools, yeah, of course, you know, in our church, all the clergy are male, so there's a opportunity there when they gather to speak to them, especially to have a feminine voice among them, to listen to them respectfully. One of the ways that we could in our church to reach men would be through the wives of deacons, because deacons in our church are married. I think deacons' wives could be wonderful advocates for this message. And I would think that would be a great way to reach out to them. So those are some places that are already set up where we have men and boys that are gathered and may be open to the message.
Thank you so much, Lori. Next, why don't we hear from Sojourners?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandy Obade. I'm the Director of Campaigns and Mobilizing here at Sojourners. For over 50 years, our Christian organization has been helping churches and individuals put their faith into action for social justice. So when we think about how do we speak to men and boys of faith and create culturally relevant materials, one of the things that we talk about is for us, it's centering our messaging from the Bible. And so you may think of the Bible and may think of like really conflicting views of men in the Bible, and you would be right in that to say that it is a document that sees and presents men in different situations and scenarios. And so it is right to say that there is not one standard of how we can address men from how the Bible talks to us for all times. But one thing that I do want to point is that oftentimes our lenses and how we read the Bible really impacts how we then create messages and craft messages for others. So I was looking this morning at a resource that was put out by USAID, and it's called Engaging Men as Partners. And it talks about like 5 different men in the Bible and how they show us characteristics that are often dismissed or that are not what we think. And so I want to invite men who are in these faith spaces to read with different lenses. And so first it talks about people like Abraham, who for many religions in this space is considered a patriarch. But when we look at his behavior, we see a man who listens to God. So first and foremost, Abraham is a listener. So we got to consider, like, how do we think of men and how do we come alongside men and help them see that listening is one of the postures that they can use. He listens to God, listens to his wife, listens over and over again. Then there's a space where a city is going to be destroyed, and Abraham pleads for the city and says, can you have compassion for these cities? So again, we see a man who is compassionate. And then my hope is that we can bring this kind of messages to men to say, like, it is it is a characteristic of what our faith invites us to ask men to be good listeners, to be compassionate, that unlike the world and how our society tells us to live as dominant or as people who impose, our faith provides spaces to say men can be listeners, they can be compassionate. We also have examples of other men that I can keep going through. I'm going to do one more, and then maybe I know that we have to keep moving in here. But I think of people like Joseph, and Joseph is also a man in the Old Testament, and he's dealt a really bad life. And instead, we're told in the Bible that this man was sold into slavery. And instead of taking revenge of his family, of course he was devastated, and of course he didn't like that. But upon processing that, when his family is in big trouble later on in his life, he now finds himself in a very prominent position, and he has lots of compassion for people. So again, an example of someone that was able to offer forgiveness, that was able to not seek revenge, and that was able to express compassion. So I think we can use these kinds of frameworks to bring men and boys of faith, particularly of those of Christian faith, to say that they can be people of compassion, they can be good listeners. And of course, as we craft all these messages, I would invite men to be with us so that they can speak a language that resonates with them as well. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sandy. Is anyone here from Sikh Family Center? No? Okay, so why don't we move on? Next, I'm so excited to introduce our speaker today, Tahani Chaudhry from Peaceful Families Projects. Tahani can tell you quickly a little bit about herself, and then she'll get started on today's workshop.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me here. I'm very excited. Just given the conversation that we've already started, I'm just already feeling rejuvenated, but also very honored to be in a space with so many experts and so many thoughtful folks who are doing this work on the ground. I want to start off with introducing myself. My name is Tahani Chaudhry. I am here on behalf of Peaceful Families Project. Peaceful Families is a 21-year-old nonprofit organization that has been working to eliminate family-based violence in the Muslim communities. And we use the word eliminate very intentionally because that is our goal. It's very lofty. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, but that is what we are working towards. And in order to do that, we have to understand that domestic violence and family-based violence is not a women's issue. It is something that affects all of us. And in order to find a solution for it, in order to eliminate it, we have to make sure that our entire community is engaged in doing that, which is why for us, that was a pivotal moment in kind of our organization's history to be like, we need men in these spaces. We need men's voices in order to make social change that is lasting and impactful. I am the Research and Resource Development Coordinator of Peaceful Families. I am also a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology, and so a lot of the lens that I work through often comes from an integration of psychological perspectives and faith-based practices. I want to emphasize that I want this space to be a space of shared learning. I do not believe that I am teaching you all anything that is new that you haven't already lived or experienced. And I want to make sure that this is a space of mutual learning. So feel free to use the chat. Feel free to raise your hand during the presentation if you want to raise a point. I welcome the idea of this being a conversation. So I want to just start off with this idea of understanding what inclusive messaging is and why we do it. So when we're thinking about inclusive messaging, we're defining it as using language, images, and stories that respect and reflect the identities, experiences, and perspectives of all of the different groups and individuals that we are serving, and avoiding those stereotypes, biases, and exclusions. This is such an important definition because when we are talking about serving a community, it is important that we understand the diversity of that community. And I'm going to frame this workshop kind of from the perspective of the work that we do at PFP, which is working with American Muslim communities. The Muslim community in America and worldwide is incredibly diverse. We have racial and ethnic diversity. We have diversity in our community here in America in terms of immigration status. We have diversity in languages, even in sect within the religious faith, right? So it's so important that when we are identifying the messaging that we are communicating to our community, it respects and reflects the range of diversity that exists. And that's why we're all doing this work. So why is that important? It's important because, and I think Sandy brought this up, but this idea of we are using faith application for social change, and that is what brings in social justice. And if we are aspiring towards a just society, we need to make sure we're including the wide variety of experiences and individuals. This is also important because we want to build trust and credibility with our community, right? If we are working with the community, we do not want to come in with a savior complex to say, I will fix you, I will end domestic violence in this community, right? We want to come in where it's a mutual relationship, and the only way to make that mutual relationship is through trust. And I think there were folks who mentioned that too. I think Ayana, like talking about the community's voices have to be involved. And then also thinking about the only way to make our work matter is if people are engaging with it, right? If people are coming and listening and buying into what we're telling them. And the only way to do that is if we're actually speaking to them and to their experiences. And that's why inclusive messaging is one of the most important ways to do it. So when we are thinking about inclusive messaging, particularly when we're engaging men and boys in faith communities, what are some of the messages around gender-based violence that men hear in your individual communities? I'm curious if you all want to like type it in the chat or if anyone wants to say it out loud, but what are some of the just messages that they hear about gender-based violence? It's not their problem. That's a really important one, right? That's a women's issue. I'm not gonna get into that. Thank you for sharing. We also often hear that men are violent, right? Men are the problem. They're the ones who are aggressive and perpetrators. And I can't remember who mentioned that earlier, but someone said that, right? That defensiveness of, can I enter this space if it's kind of going to be put onto me? It doesn't happen in my community. I hear that all of the time from imams and religious leaders in the Muslim community. Like, oh, I don't think we need to have that workshop. Like, I've been working here for 30 years and there hasn't been a single domestic violence case. The messages are directed at them. Yeah, exactly. It was just a mistake. Why are you making such a big deal out of it? Yeah, so a lot of times when we are hearing messages around domestic violence, these are the things that you all are describing. These are the things we might hear from the men and boys in our communities. And what we might also hear, and PFP has been seeing this more and more with our male allies group, which we started 2 years ago, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit. But we've been hearing this space of like, I don't feel like I have a space in this work, in this realm of domestic violence work, because it's primarily women and they're all like, they're all just blaming men for the problem. And that makes, for them, feels like a barrier to engage, right? The messaging that they're hearing or that they expect to hear acts as a barrier. So what consequences does that have, right? There are men and boys who are feeling defensive and then they feel disengaged. They're like, I don't want to engage with that. Another really important piece for us to always consider when we're talking about engaging men and boys is that men can be victims of domestic violence. Men can be victims of family-based violence, and they are. And so when we have spaces that are framing men as the problem, men as the perpetrators, what it makes people who are victims or male survivors of domestic violence, it makes them feel silenced or forgotten. This space isn't actually helping me. It's not talking about me. And that's something we need to overcome. And we also have to understand that the communities that we're in, right, they are housed within a larger social context. So what are the types of conversations that are happening in that wider social context, right? a lot of what we've seen in recent years is this rise of folks talking about toxic masculinity. And what does that mean? There has been a rise in the red pill movement. And for folks who don't know what the red pill movement, it's a movement that came up in response to the feminist movement, that was talking about, oh, well, I don't want the idea of what masculinity is to be superimposed on me. So let me talk about what masculinity is. And oftentimes, those conversations tend to veer into a realm that actually perpetuates cycles of violence. So we have conversations from figures like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, who are very engaging to young boys, and young boys are listening to them. And we've seen this particularly in the Muslim community when Andrew Tate converted to Islam. There was a rise in young Muslim boys who were saying, I resonate with this. And the types of things he's saying is, I, keep my women in check. They listen to me. I keep them under control. And the types of messages that those are really feed into the power and control wheel that we see a lot of times in our domestic violence work. So it's important that we're connecting the work that we are doing with also social level conversations and issues. And what those social level issues often do is that they put men versus women as if it's a battle. And what we need to do in the sense of our messaging that we do is, how do we work together to make collective change? And that's going to be a shift. That's not going to be easy. It's going to be pretty hard, but we need to be very intentional about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that PFP has been working on, so that we say, okay, well, how do we include men and boys in our work? We noticed, I started working with PFP 4 years ago, and from that time, we were starting to notice that a lot of the workshops, the trainings, the programs, the community programs that we were doing were primarily women. We had maybe 1 or 2 men in the space, and we realized that there was a clear gap in the work that we were doing and the engagement of Muslim men, the people that we needed to have their voices and ears in the room. So what we did is we built a structure for them to be involved in, right? How do we be intentional about bringing men and boys into this work? So what we did is we started our Male Allies group, and that was 2021. And it started with just a handful of people who had come to our imam trainings, people who had come to some of our programs, people who were already in our kind of like network, right? And then what we did was, once we built that structure, it expanded out. The second thing is listening to their concerns and experiences. One of the most important parts of community work that you all know and already do is not imposing my agenda onto what I want you all to do, but instead really hearing from you. So in this Male Allies group, we had an agenda, yes. PFP had the agenda that we want to end domestic violence, and we want your help as men to do that. And that was clear from the front. And at the same time, we said, we also want to create a space where you can share with us what you need and what you want. And we got so much from that listening. And we implemented the ideas, we implemented the needs from that group. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we did to implement it, but the listening space is so important. And then finally, male-led and centered research initiatives. We understood that the work that we were doing, it was important that we had male leaders in the room who were guiding it, so that they were speaking to their experiences as Muslim men, and with the support of peaceful families, with the support of women. It's not saying that this has to be, if we're going to engage men, it only has to be men. That's not true at all. Because what we want to do is we want to work together and bring our strengths to make change. So one of the initiatives that we are doing right now is we started a research project with one of the men in our Male Allies group, and he is a PhD in marriage and family therapy. And we started a research project to say, okay, well, let's learn more about men's perspectives of domestic violence. What do they think about this? And he is leading this project. He is bringing in some of his male peers, where he is just reaching out to them and saying, I think you need to be on this project. And as a man, this is your responsibility. So even amongst the conversation from man to man of the accountability piece of, you need to be engaged with this work. And that kind of creates a cycle of how we then network out and grow the movement. So in our areas of interest in the initiative, in this kind of engaging men and boys initiative, one of the first things that we encountered, and this was from the Male Allies group and talking to people in the community, is that we really need to end the stigma that male victims feel. Male victims in our community feel that they are not able to talk about it. They don't have resources. They don't have services that are geared towards them. If they do share their experiences of gender-based violence or family-based violence, they're going to be shunned or made fun of. And in fact, there was actually a case that someone came to us last month and said, hey, there is someone in our community in Texas who is a man, and he's saying, my wife, who is a prominent leader in the community, has abused me in various ways. And no one in the community was supporting him. And so we see that these cases exist. We see that this barrier to being able to seek services, being able to speak your truth exists. So one of our main areas then is, how do we overcome that barrier? How do we start talking about male survivors of domestic violence and start that conversation? The second one is male allyship and bystander intervention. So I talked already a little bit about what our Male Allies group and how we built this kind of network for men to feel like they had support in the work that they were doing. A lot of these folks are leaders in their communities, or their community members who feel like we're not talking about this enough, but they were in their individual silos across the country. And the helpful thing that we can do as a national organization is bring those people together and create a space and community for them to share their experiences and share their needs and learn from each other to go back to the work that they do. And that's what creates longevity in this work. Because we all know, as people who work in fields of domestic violence, is that there is a high rate of burnout. And when you feel like you don't have support, you don't have community, you don't have people who get it, that burnout is real, and it's more likely. And so what we want to do is create that space for those allies so that they can keep doing the work that they're doing, and keep making that impact at a larger scale level. But what we heard from the Male Allies in our meetings, and we just did our first national in-person convening of the Male Allies group just this past July. And what we learned from that convening is that a lot of these men were like, well, I want to be an ally. I feel like I'm empathetic. I feel like I'm listening to folks, but I just don't know what to do, right? If I am experiencing a situation in front of me, what do I do? And that sparked this conversation for us on thinking more about bystander intervention. And we've been doing a thorough literature review. We're looking at what other programs are doing. And there aren't many faith-based models of bystander intervention. So what we are doing, and there's none for the Muslim community. So what we are doing now is, in collaboration with that Male Allies group, is we're developing a new model of bystander intervention that's focused specifically on the Muslim community and Muslim men. So saying, how do we incorporate our faith-based practices into this work? So one of the hadith, which is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, that every Muslim that you will come across knows, is this idea of, if you see oppression, if you see harm, as a Muslim, what you do is, first you stop it with your hand. So you take action to stop the harm or oppression from happening. If you cannot do that, you stop it with your mouth. So you speak up. If you cannot do that, in your heart, you acknowledge that what you see was wrong. And that is the weakest of faith. And when you talk to a Muslim, they know that saying. But how can we bring that into this world of, yeah, well, how do we incorporate this in when you are seeing violence in a home? How do we incorporate that religious teaching into when you are seeing someone who is being oppressed? Do you stop it with your hand? Do you stop it with your mouth? Do you know in your heart it's wrong? And that is the way that we integrate the faith-based experiences and the buy-in that we need from the communities into the tangible, actionable work that we do. And that ties into this idea of relevant theoretical frameworks. It is so important for us, as someone who's in the field of psychology, we really don't have a lot of theoretical frameworks that are faith-based and relevant to deeply faith-based communities, deeply religious communities, very few or none that focus on Muslim communities in particular. And it's so important that we're tying some of those things in. So this idea of chivalry, this idea of protection, and that's not unique to Muslim communities, right? In general, when we're thinking about men, how do we tie in these ideas of chivalry, of protection, of what it means to be a man? And we tie that in through the Muslim theoretical framework called Fatwa, which is Islamic masculinity, and what it means to be a Muslim man. And it very much ties in those ideas of protecting your family, listening to your family, being a leader that is compassionate and empathetic. But how do we tie in those theoretical frameworks into the actual work that we're doing to make it relevant, to increase engagement and increase buy-in? So what we did about this then? Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Sandy. So in Christianity, there's a similar saying that says, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act. I love that because it understands that each and every one of us have powers in different ways, in different, capacities, but how do we utilize that power towards action and towards ending oppression? So when we talk about action steps, like, when we're thinking about theoretical frameworks, we're thinking about these ideas for how to engage men, it's important that we also think about some of those actionable ways that we provide this inclusive messaging. One example that I think is really helpful is our Peaceful Partners Pledge. This is something that we launched 2 years ago now, similar to the same time as when we were running that Male Allies group in the beginning. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but the idea is to increase engagement for social change and branding a little bit, right? Of how are we presenting this message to folks? The second one is merchandise. And we view merchandise as a way as a badge of honor almost, as a stamp to say, I am an ally for people who are experiencing domestic violence. I am here for you. I will intervene. I will support you in these various ways. And then also on targeted infographics, because it's so important that we are providing information and education in a way that has faith-based content, that's age appropriate, and that provides people with just the baseline information that they need that they often don't know because there's such a stigma of domestic violence in a lot of our communities. So the infographics is a way to bridge even that informational gap. Okay, so let's go deeper into those 3 initiatives. So the Peaceful Partners Pledge is a way for Muslim men to go onto our website, sign this pledge, and basically what it says is that I am a Muslim man, I am the leader of my household, and that is language that very much comes from Islamic principles and teachings. I am the leader of this household. But my leadership does not include oppression or violence. My leadership includes compassion, listening, mutual consultation, right? So it's thinking about, let's utilize this framework that we received from Islamic principles of, okay, you're the leader of this household, but what does leadership mean to you? How do you enact leadership? And that gets the buy-in, right? Because a lot of times we have folks who are like, oh, well, we are the leader of the household, so we get to decide what's happening. And they engage in those kind of violent or controlling patterns, but we address the root of the cause, right? That leadership piece. Well, what does that mean? Let's turn back to faith and understand what leadership in Islam looks like. And it's interesting, right? Because when we think about leaders, I think Sandy gave these examples earlier, like Prophet Abraham, Joseph and like other prophets, the Prophet Muhammad. All of these folks were leaders in their communities and leaders in their households, and they were incredibly empathetic. They were incredibly compassionate. They were incredibly emotionally intelligent. And those are not things that we necessarily connect to masculinity right now, even though we should, even though men have this capacity. But oftentimes men are told to suppress it. So when we turn to these prophetic examples of leadership and kindness and compassion, it reframes the narrative around what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a man. This also increases engagement in the sense that then we have folks who are signing this pledge, and we're building that network of allyship. And what this pledge does is it has a twofold purpose, right? It shows to folks outside of the Muslim community, hey, look, this is what Muslim men are pledging to. This is what Muslim men believe. And it shows to folks within the community, maybe even survivors in the community, to say, this is the message of Muslim leadership, or the message of relationships that you have been fed in your abusive relationship. That's not the message that these 10,000 men are signing on to, right? And the power that comes from that. It's interesting because in our Peaceful Partner Pledge, we had to think a lot about branding. And I have two examples here, actually. So there's this house with a heart, and then there's this climbing this mountain and helping each other climb up this mountain. So we have numbers on our website, how many people have signed on to this pledge so far. The goal of our Male Allies group is to get to 10,000 pledges. So we have this kind of like tracker on the website. And when we were thinking about even how do we put that tracker on the website, how do we design it? One of our team members suggested this beautiful house with the heart inside that really shows the compassion, the love, the peaceful families, right? And we realized, well, that may not be the imagery that is resonating the most with the men in our community. And so we changed it into, and we consulted with the Male Allies group, of course. And so we changed it into, there's this mountain that someone is climbing, and each pledge we get, they get higher on the mountain. And so even understanding the imagery and the motivation that goes behind that branding piece that encourages people to participate, that motivates them, can be different when we're thinking about engaging men and boys specifically. So next we think about our merchandise. So we recently launched this. It is a way to, so it is on our website. There are stickers, there are kind of like enamel pins, there's t-shirts and tote bags. So you can really get our merchandise in a lot of different forms. But when we were thinking about the imagery of these designs, we were being very intentional in thinking about what is age appropriate, what is gender appropriate, what is going to resonate with folks. And then we consulted with our Male Allies group, we got their feedback, and this is what our designer kind of came up with. But this first one really ties into that piece of protection and chivalry that we talked about earlier. The idea of showing strength to protect. So it's this logo that says Muslim men in defense of Muslim women. How do we show up as Muslim men to protect and defend our sisters in this faith? The second one takes on a slightly different kind of approach where it's more of that caring, that nurturing. How do we bring in these folks who want to talk about eliminating domestic violence, but providing some of that gentle imagery around it? And what we put on there is a saying from the Prophet Muhammad. And this was actually a quote from his final sermon. So it was the last sermon before he died. And one of the final things he said is, treat the women well. And so what we're doing is we're going back to faith-based principles and sayings to motivate folks into engaging and motivate folks into taking on the accountability and responsibility of saying, I have a responsibility to engage in this work because this is what my religion is preaching. And then this last one is more geared towards youth. There is a recent rise in going back to more retro 70s-esque imagery, especially on like social media. So it's the same, you know, phrase from the Prophet Muhammad, take care of women. But it's presented in graphics that is more geared towards younger folks. And so when we're thinking about inclusive messaging, there is a lot of thought and intentionality that goes even in the branding of what is the messaging that we're putting out there. We were also thinking about slogans for what are the ways that, like, what are the hashtags? What are the kind of key terms that we're going to be using? And one of the first one is when oftentimes we're talking about this idea of male privilege. And it's funny because this is something that directly came out of our male allies group, where one of the members said, you know what, I really don't feel that privileged right now. I really don't feel like the society I'm in, the community I am in, as a man, I don't feel that privileged. I feel like I have a lot of barriers. And the men had a conversation around that of like what privilege meant to them and the ways that they're privileged in their lives and in their communities. And one of our members said this. He said, you know what? I feel really privileged to protect my family and to protect my community. And everyone resonated so much with that we adopted that as a slogan for that as men, we are privileged to protect. Another one is DV, not my deen. Really going, and deen in, you know, for Muslims translates to faith. That DV is not in my faith. And so as a Muslim, I'm speaking out to say, nope, that's not what my faith says. And the last one is this stand up, speak out. It's this idea of rising up collectively and taking action. And so these are slogans and branding and imagery that all come from months of listening to the community, of listening to people's experiences, of understanding what are the things that resonate well with them and what are the things that don't. And it's okay if they don't, right? So let's talking through some of that. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sandy. I think the spirituality of our faith-based communities is one of the biggest strengths. And I mentioned earlier that I'm a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology, and my dissertation is on how religious institutions have the capacity to protect. They have such strengths in being able to protect. And yet, right now in the society that we're in, oftentimes religious institutions and communities are framed in the light of actually they cause harm. And that is a reality. There are many people who are feeling harm in their religious communities and spaces. So how do we minimize that harm and uplift the help? And one of the approach that Peaceful Families takes is that the solution to domestic violence isn't moving away from Islam, but it's actually returning to the original Islam, right? And I think that that's a kind of approach that probably all of us in this room are utilizing, right? How do we return to our faith-based practices as a means of protection and caring and prevention of violence? So let me show you all a little bit of the infographics that we have been using and putting out to provide information and education to the community and provide some of these new frameworks that we are you know, developing together with the Male Allies Group. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I know that we are short on time and want to get to the questions. But this is our Stand Up, Speak Out infographic. You all saw that slogan earlier. But how do I do this myself, right? So thinking about the different levels in which I can take action. How do I do it myself? How do I do it in my family, right? So it's like going from the individual to the interpersonal, and then how do I do it with my community? So if you all have ever seen the Bronfenbrenner socio-ecological model, we understand that all of us are housed within these multiple circles of influence. And what we want to do is make sure that each and every one of our allies is thinking about their circle of influence and how the influence kind of expands. And one of the really important pieces here that, and this is so the infographic is broken up here just so you can all see it better. You can go to our website to see the full form. But this little brown piece is what we have at the very bottom. And it's be comfortable with discomfort. Again, that's something that came out of conversations with our male allies. This is an uncomfortable space and an uncomfortable conversation. And then we give them resources to say, hey, you can read more by clicking here. So it's not just an infographic to say you're starting here and it ends, right? This is just the start to learn more. How do we get you in the resources that you need to learn more and to be able to take that action? This next one was actually developed by one of our youth representative in the Male Allies group. So he was a senior in high school when he developed this infographic for us. But he was thinking about adapting that previous infographic for young men specifically, right? So you can see that he changed up the branding, the images that are being used, the colors. He really didn't like how the dark blue was like super masculine. He was like, actually, I want to lighten this up a little bit. And so he proposed this different one, and it has different examples that he felt would resonate more for youth, right? And then I'm going to go to our third one, and this is another one that our youth intern actually came up with. And so he was reading up on this framework of Fatah, which is an Islamic framework on positive Muslim masculinity. And so in his time working with us, he was like diving deeper into this, and he came up with these 7 or 8 principles for what positive Muslim masculinity is, and he put them in this infographic form. So thinking about truthfulness, loving and tolerance for the sake of God, vigilant care, humility, service towards others, respecting your parents, and generosity. And then in the bullets, he talks more about kind of the ways we can implement those as models of masculinity in Islam, and then how they tie into preventing and intervening with violence in our communities. But as you can see, it's so important to have those voices of men in the room to even shape their own experiences of what it means to be a man. And it's really important for me as a woman in the room to understand my position, right? As a woman, I cannot speak to your experience as a man. So how do I make sure I'm uplifting your voice and your experiences? And this work comes with its challenges, right? We get a lot of critique. And we've actually, after our first convening of Male Allies, we got hate messages, right? We got comments on our post that said things like, these men are brainwashed. Why are they there? These feminists are just trying to feed them their agenda. And that is a response that you might see when you start engaging with this work. There's a lot of terminology that can be really contentious. Even the word feminist can be contentious when you're talking to different groups of people. I have a lot of male allies in our group that don't identify with the word feminist and are very critical of it. The other thing is that men can be uncomfortable in these spaces, and we need to understand that. We need to respect that. It makes sense because they aren't often deeply entrenched in this work like women have been for decades. So they might need guidance, they might need some directive and availability for that room to grow. We don't want to go in just immediately critiquing, immediately trying to, shaping them into what we want them to be. We want them to be exactly who they are and learn from each other. And then this idea of there really are no faith models that exist in the Muslim community. So we are left with the task of filling that gap. So the needs that we've been seeing is that we need more male leadership and representation in these spaces. And we've been working really hard on that. How do we engage some of these leaders who can then bring in, community members and guide them towards this idea of allyship? There's a need for individual personalized invitation, and I can talk more about this, but many of the men in our group are not there because of social media campaign. They are not there because they just saw the work that we were doing somewhere. They are there because they have a personal connection. They are the husband, the brother, the son of someone who is passionate about working with domestic violence. And that was their pathway in getting in. Many of them are there because we individually reached out to them and said, hey, you are a great fit to be a male ally. We want you to come here. And they need that, right? So being very personalized and expanding these efforts, we found is really important. And the other thing is the need for a legitimacy and social standing of the presenters. We need people who have religious expertise. We need religious faith-based leaders in that group, imams, etc. We need people who have DV expertise, right? We need the psychologists, the social workers, the DV advocates, and the DV survivors in the room to speak to those experiences with expertise. And we've also found that folks who are socially liked already tend to draw in more engagement. And that's something that we've been trying really hard to navigate. And then finally, the lessons learned. And I think these are things that I've already covered in the previous things I've said, but when you create the space, they come. When we first created the Male Allies group, the very first meeting, we had 3 male allies in that room. And the very last one that we had, which was actually our most recent meeting, was last week, and there were 30 people in that room. And I was so shocked because persistence pays off. We did this for 2 years and it expanded from this small budding group into something that is motivated. The men in that group are coming up with their own ideas. They're going out and doing it in the communities. They're recruiting. They're thinking of ways, new models and ideas. And so that persistence was so important. And we create those models and those ideas from community knowledge and expertise. We really want to understand that we are not coming to this community. We are not coming to these men and boys to say, we know the answer. We are saying, hey, let's work together with your expertise, our expertise, and create and build something that can make social change. We're nurturing a space for growth, not critique. And we really welcome and encourage diversity in thought, approaches, language. We have people we may disagree with in those rooms. And that's actually, that not only is it okay, but that's beneficial because it's so important for us to be speaking over those divides. We can't only be speaking in an echo chamber. We need to be talking to people who might have different perspectives and then growing together from those different perspectives. So these are a bunch of next steps. I will skip it because I understand that we have, limited time. Thank you all for, just creating the time and space for this today. And Alana, I'll pass it back to you for closing question or any question and answer if we want.
Thank you so much, Tahani. This was a very, very informative webinar workshop, and it's such a pleasure to work with your organization on this important work. I just want to let anyone know that if they have follow-up questions for Tahani or anyone else at Peaceful Families Project, you can go to their website or also the website that I put into the chat to request TGA from any of our Interfaith Consortium members. And very quickly, since we only have a few minutes left, I'd like to ask a follow-up question to our Interfaith Consortium members along the lines of this topic today. What key takeaways would you advise organizations to have in mind when updating their messaging? Why don't we begin with sojourners?
Yes. Thank you, Tahani. I think I love what you were saying about how you listened to the community and drew back into that spiritual rootedness and to the true aspects of our community. So as organizations seek to update their messaging, do not forget that the resources that they already have at their disposals in their faith texts, and to listen well to what is resonating. And listen for those signs. I love like how our listen for those quick things that we're seeing that dismiss the goodness that it's in our faith.
Thank you, Sandy. Yujima?
Yeah, there were a lot of really good takeaways. Definitely don't feel like you're starting from scratch with messaging. Like you're getting the messaging from the community and picking up on different language that's used, picking up on different themes that are really being talked about and like using that to propel your work. And then also I really, really like the point about when we're thinking about like messaging and design, that sometimes the more obvious route is not necessarily the route to take. So for instance, blue, like that deep dark blue doesn't have to be just splattered on everything. Like I love reframing what masculinity looks like in a different setting. So I think that was a really, really great piece that I'm going to take back with me as well.
Great, thank you so much. I don't know if anyone else from our consortium is still on the call. No, Korean families has had to drop off. Catholics for Family Peace, do you have anything to add?
I was so impressed with the graphics that you created, and that those could be really useful just in social media, and I'd like to explore more about how that model could reach out to my faith community. So that's great. Great job.
Thank you so much. Now, does anyone have any questions for Tahani on anything that was presented today? It was an incredibly thorough workshop, but we're always happy to answer any follow-up questions. Feel free to unmute or put them into the chat. Now, Tahani, I know that in the interest of time, we had to quickly jump through the last slide, but what would you say are the most crucial next steps for any advocacy organization wanting to take this on and update their messaging?
Yeah, so I'll just go back to that slide because, if there are folks, and people will be able to receive the slides later, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think the way PFP thinks about next steps is in two ways, right? We have very tangible, specific action plans, like we're creating a bystander intervention, et cetera, things like that, that all of us as organizations do a lot of the actionable, projects. And we also want to think about it at the larger level of social change, right? So what are the ways that we are creating social change? And we think about that often in the lens of, well, what are maybe some of the whispers of violence that are happening? Maybe even before someone is perpetrating violence, what are the types of messaging or things that are happening in the community that might lead to it? Right. And so listening is another theme of that, of like being in touch with what is ongoing in the community so that you're able to address those whispers of violence as they arise and before something escalates to the level of abuse. And I think for us, that's a really important piece of social change.
Great. Thank you so much, Tahani. This is excellent.
Thank you all so much for having me, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or follow up later.
Definitely. We're going to be sending out these slides. They will also be available on our website along with the recording of this program today. Just want to let everybody know about some upcoming programs. Our next workshop is Cultural Competency Training, Overcoming Misconceptions to Engage Men of Faith as Allies. That will take place January 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern. We also, as a reminder, have monthly office hours every second Thursday of the month at 1 p.m. Eastern as well. And as always, feel free to reach out to us with any questions or go on our website to request TTA from any of our Interfaith Consortium members. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about this important topic, and we look forward to working with you soon.